Welcome to BWC News. I am Elizabeth. According to the U.S. Treasury Department, the U.S. government has only about $170 billion left available on its books. If the U.S. Congress cannot reach a consensus to extend the debt ceiling, then the U.S. government is likely to be in another shutdown as soon as the end of May. The government shutdown is not the most critical. The worst consequence is that the payment of U.S. bonds may be at risk of default. While the probability of this is small, and it is highly likely that the U.S. Congress will eventually raise the fiscal debt ceiling, the risk does exist. The U.S. faces the loss of 500,000 jobs as China continues to sell U.S. debt. Although the U.S. media says the U.S. is eager to talk to China, the U.S. side is not offering any sincerity and is instead shifting the blame. Currently, China has reduced its holdings of U.S. debt for 7 consecutive months. According to the latest data, China has reduced its holdings by $173.2 billion in the whole year of 2022, plus the first 2 months of this year, a total of $191.6 billion. In fact, Japan is also reducing its holdings, but the U.S. is most concerned that China not reduce its holdings too much. At the same time, the White House and the Federal Reserve have warned that the debt crisis is worsening due to a bitter bipartisanship in the United States, which could lead to the loss of 500,000 jobs. Now, the U.S. is facing a growing crisis in the banking sector as deposits erupt from several banks. Silicon Valley Bank, Signature Bank, and First Republic Bank have all collapsed, with Westpac Bank becoming the latest focus of the crisis. For its part, the U.S. is very hopeful that China will lend a helping hand to the Western economy, as it did after the subprime crisis erupted in 2008. On the surface, U.S. politicians and officials are busy promoting a good faith dialogue between the U.S. and China. Various U.S. officials always want to visit China these days and are trying to arrange meetings between Treasury Secretary Yellen and Commerce Secretary Raimondo with top Chinese officials. U.S. media reports say President Joe Biden also hopes to speak with Chinese leaders in the near future. The Americans seem eager to show good faith, but the self-respecting Americans don't seem to know what good faith means. Recently, the U.S. Department of Transportation approved an increase in the number of weekly flights between China and the United States by Chinese carriers to 12, which is comparable to that of U.S. carriers. But this is really just a return to reciprocity, not good faith at all. The foreign media described it as a so-called concession. The sincerity of U.S. officials is only expressed in words. In her latest speech, Treasury Secretary Yellen said that China's economic growth is not necessarily incompatible with the economic leadership of the United States. But on the other hand, she advocated the implementation of new bills, such as the Inflation Reduction Act, which was implemented to counter China. Yellen believes that conflict between the United States and China is inevitable, is wrong, because the United States remains the most dynamic and prosperous economy in the world. However, she is not opposed to the U.S. side to fully contain China in all areas. China, the second largest holder of U.S. debt, has been reducing its holdings for more than a dozen months, but still has nearly $850 billion to recover. If the U.S. Congress fails to reach a consensus to extend the debt ceiling, leading to a default on U.S. debt, will the U.S. still pay us back? If the U.S. does not pay us back, what will be the impact on the U.S. and the world? Does the Chinese yuan have a chance to surpass the U.S. dollar? Let's take a brief look below. If the U.S. debt defaults, the most serious impact is not a mere $850 billion, but the U.S. itself. The U.S. is one of the world's largest creditors. In some ways, the U.S. relies on debt to fuel its own economy. Since the fall of President Clinton, the U.S. has been in almost a debt-driven economic development mode. The U.S. has been able to borrow a steady stream of money because of its ability to export dollars to the world through its trade deficit and then get them back for its own use by way of U.S. debt. In other words, the U.S. uses cheap dollars to purchase goods from around the world. The countries that get the dollars have no other place to go for investment other than to buy the goods that the U.S. is allowed to buy. Therefore, the U.S. has designed a place to go, and that place is U.S. debt. Because investment in U.S. debt can at least still get some investment income. If you let the huge amount of foreign exchange reserves lying on the account does not move, can only be increasingly devalued. The downside of this model is that it makes the US debt, the big thunder, grows stronger, to the point where the US revenue can barely pay off the rhythm of the US debt. Therefore, if you want to maintain the US debt does not default, you can only keep raising the debt ceiling to borrow new to pay off the old. If some part of this model is broken, it means that the US debt is in default. According to the world's investment banks, if the US debt defaults, the US economy could shrink by about 10% that year, and US stocks could fall by about 50%. Then, the US would instantly fall from a superpower to a relative power. It would become very difficult to borrow money from the world again in the future, and without the debt-driven economic model, China could overtake the US as the world's top power in a very short time. Second, as to whether the $850 billion of treasuries we have not yet sold off will be defaulted by the US, we can derive the answer from the fact that China has been reducing its US debt holdings for more than a dozen months. Whether the US debt defaults or not, we are worried about possible US fraud. Therefore, in addition to our continued selling of US debt because of some foreign outflows due to the dollar's interest rate hike, the core important reason is to avoid possible US fraud. The US has used its allies to confiscate Russian assets around the world, and this is still fresh in our minds. Therefore, we are not only accelerating the sale of US debt, but also accelerating the internationalization of the RMB in international trade. Finally, if a default on US debt leads to a collapse of the dollar's credit, then the dollar's world dominance could simply collapse. The end of the dollar's hegemony is bound to be accompanied by the birth of another strong currency. And this currency is most likely to be the RMB. The logic is easy to understand: the settlement of world trade cannot be bartered, there must be a currency that everyone recognizes as an intermediary. The dollar has served this role for a long time. As China surpasses the US in terms of trade and economic output, the renminbi is likely to become a commonly accepted currency around the world. But there is another extreme scenario to consider here, and that is that if the dollar's credibility collapses, the US may want to preserve the dollar's international standing by waging war to bring down or drag down countries that resist the dollar's hegemony. One should not think that this is unlikely, because all indications are that the US has already begun to prepare for it. It's the end of this video. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe to the channel to support. See you next time.